The scent of burnt sugar, a phantom sweetness that clung to the air, was the first anomaly. Eleanor, a woman whose life was meticulously ordered, a symphony of routines played out in hushed tones, stirred in her sleep. It wasn't the usual comforting aroma of her late-night baking experiment gone slightly awry. This was sharper, more acrid, a harbinger of something unpleasant. Her eyelids fluttered open, heavy with the remnants of a dream about a garden overrun with wilting roses. Beside her, nestled against her pillow like a warm, furry comma, was Jasper. He was a creature of exquisite refinement, a Siamese cat with eyes like chips of sapphire and a coat the color of toasted almonds. Jasper was, by all accounts, a creature of habit himself. His nights were dedicated to silent patrols of the darkened house, his days to sun-drenched naps and the occasional disdainful flick of his tail at the incompetence of the outside world. He rarely stirred during the night, save for a soft purr that vibrated through Eleanor's mattress, a gentle lullaby. But tonight, Jasper was not purring. Instead, he was restless. He shifted, his lithe body a taut coil of unease. Eleanor felt it, a subtle tremor in the familiar weight of him. Then, a soft, insistent meow, unlike his usual melodious trills, vibrated against her ear. It was a sound laced with urgency, a plea. Eleanor, a creature of deep affection for her feline companion, instinctively reached out a hand to stroke him. Her fingers met not the usual silky fur, but a bristling intensity. Jasper pulled away, his body arching, his sapphire eyes wide and fixed on something beyond her in the room. He let out another meow, this one louder, more insistent, a guttural cry that pierced the quietude of the night. A prickle of unease, cold and sharp, began to snake its way up Eleanor's spine. She sat up, her movements slow, hesitant. The room was cloaked in darkness, the familiar outlines of her antique dresser and the towering bookshelf blurred into indistinct shadows. The air, however, was no longer just tinged with the burnt sugar scent. It was thicker, heavier, and carried with it a faint, acrid sting that made her throat itch. "Jasper, what is it, darling?" she whispered, her voice thick with sleep. Jasper didn't respond with his usual gentle rub against her hand. He leaped from the bed, his landing silent on the plush carpet. He stood at the foot of the bed, his tail bushed out like a bottle brush, his body rigid. He looked towards the closed bedroom door, his gaze unwavering. And then, he let out a sound that Eleanor had never heard before. It was a screech, a raw, desperate alarm that echoed through the stillness, a sound that stripped away the last vestiges of her sleepy comfort and replaced it with a chilling dread. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. She swung her legs out of bed, her feet finding the cool floor. The scent was undeniable now. Smoke. Not the faint, sweet char of burnt sugar, but the acrid, biting stench of something burning, something dangerous. Panic. A cold hand squeezed her lungs. She fumbled for the bedside lamp, her fingers clumsy and trembling. The click of the switch was met with a weak, flickering glow, barely pushing back the encroaching darkness. The smoke was visible now, a hazy tendril curling from beneath the bedroom door. Jasper, sensing her rising fear, nudged her leg with his head, a frantic, repeated motion. He then turned and darted towards the door, scratching at it with an intensity that was both terrifying and a clear directive. "The door!" Eleanor gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "The door is smoky." Her mind, usually a well-oiled machine of logic and calm, was a chaotic storm. Her husband, Thomas, was asleep in the spare room down the hall, recovering from a minor surgery. Her daughter, Lily, a bright, spirited 12-year-old, was in her own room at the other end of the house. The thought of them, vulnerable and asleep, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She reached for the doorknob, her hand hesitating. What if the fire was on the other side? What if opening it unleashed a torrent of flames? But Jasper was there, his insistent yowls urging her forward. He was not just a pet. He was a member of their family, and his distress was a primal scream that resonated deep within her. Taking a deep, shaky breath, Eleanor turned the knob. A blast of hot, smoky air hit her face, stinging her eyes and making her cough. The hallway was no longer a familiar expanse of muted colors. It was a swirling vortex of gray, the air thick and suffocating. The flickering light from her room barely illuminated the terrifying scene. Flames, small at first, but growing with horrifying speed, were licking at the far end of the hallway, near the staircase. The crackling sound, a hungry beast devouring the house, was growing louder. "Thomas!" Eleanor screamed, her voice hoarse, raw with fear. She stumbled into the hallway, coughing violently, her eyes watering uncontrollably. Jasper, surprisingly, stayed close, his small body a reassuring weight against her ankles, though his yowls continued, a constant, desperate soundtrack to the unfolding disaster. She had to get to Thomas. He was still recovering, his movements limited. The thought of him trapped, disoriented by the smoke, was a fresh horror. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to keep low, the smoke stinging her lungs. Each breath was a painful effort, a desperate struggle for air. Thomas, a man of quiet strength and unwavering devotion, was roused by the cacophony. The frantic scratching of Jasper at his door, followed by Eleanor's desperate screams, jolted him from a deep, pain-induced sleep. He sat up, his body protesting the sudden movement, the familiar ache in his side a dull throb. Then, he smelled it. Smoke. Thick, acrid, and terrifyingly close. He fumbled for his bedside lamp, his movement slower than usual, hampered by his recent surgery. The light revealed a haze of smoke seeping under his door. Panic, a sensation he rarely indulged in, threatened to overwhelm him. Eleanor's screams echoed in his ears. Lily. The thought of Lily, his vibrant, beautiful daughter, filled him with a primal urge to protect. He swung his legs out of bed, wincing as his side protested. He tried the doorknob. It was hot to the touch. A wave of dread washed over him. The hallway was the only way to Lily's room, and the hallway was clearly compromised. "Eleanor!" he bellowed, his voice rough with sleep and fear. "Are you all right? Thomas, the fire!" Eleanor's voice, strained and choked, reached him. "It's at the stairs." The stairs. That was the main artery of their home, the connection between the two floors. If those were engulfed, escape would be a terrifying gamble. Thomas's mind raced, trying to find a solution, a way to get to his wife and daughter. His vision was slightly blurred by the smoke seeping under his door. He could hear Jasper's frantic yowls, a symphony of terror that underscored the urgency of the situation. He pushed open his door, a blast of hot, smoky air hitting him. The hallway was a terrifying spectacle. Flames, like hungry tongues, were already devouring the wooden banister of the staircase. The air was thick, visibility reduced to mere feet. He could see Eleanor, a spectral figure in the haze, coughing and struggling. Jasper, a small beacon of frantic energy, was darting between Eleanor and the door to Lily's room, his meows sharp and insistent. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation, his feline instincts amplified by the primal fear that gripped the house. "Lily!" Thomas shouted, his voice cracking. He knew he couldn't go through the flames. The staircase was a raging inferno. He had to find another way. His mind, despite the fear, began to work, to analyze the layout of the house, to search for an alternative escape route. The back of the house, the kitchen, the back door. It was a longer route, but potentially safer. He turned back to Eleanor, his heart aching at the sight of her distress. "Eleanor, the stairs are gone. We have to go the other way," he yelled, his voice strained. "The kitchen! Get to the kitchen!" Eleanor, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming, nodded grimly. She understood. The staircase was their lifeline, and it was now a barrier of fire. Thomas, his body aching, his face etched with worry, began to move, his movement slow but determined, towards the kitchen. Eleanor following closely. Jasper, a frantic, furry shadow, leading the way. The house, their sanctuary, had become a roaring beast, and their only hope lay in escaping its fiery maw. The hallway was a swirling vortex of gray, thick and suffocating, a spectral figure of smoke and heat. Eleanor's eyes watered uncontrollably, stinging from the acrid bite that clawed at her throat with every shallow breath. Jasper, a frantic, furry shadow, darted ahead, his insistent yowls a desperate soundtrack to the unfolding disaster. He was a small beacon of frantic energy in the encroaching darkness, his every movement amplified by the primal fear gripping Eleanor's chest. "Jasper, lead the way." Thomas's voice, raw with effort and strain, cracked behind her. He was a step slower, his body protesting the sudden, violent upheaval of his recovery. Each movement sent a dull throb through his freshly stitched incision, a constant reminder of his compromised state. The haze of smoke seeping under doors and through cracks was a tangible presence, a cold hand squeezing his lungs. Eleanor followed Jasper, her heart aching with a terrifying certainty. The familiar expanse of muted colors that made up their home was rapidly being devoured by a hungry beast of fire. The crackling sound, once a distant murmur, was now a roaring inferno, a terrifying chorus of destruction. She could feel the heat radiating from the walls, a physical manifestation of the danger that had so brutally invaded their sanctuary. "Thomas, be careful!" she choked out, her voice hoarse. The wooden banister, usually a smooth, comforting presence, felt impossibly hot to the touch, a testament to the raging inferno that had claimed the main artery of their home. The staircase, their usual route to freedom, was a terrifying gamble, engulfed in a torrent of flames that licked at the far end of the hallway. Jasper, however, was unwavering. He weaved through the thickening smoke, his sapphire eyes, usually so serene, now wide with a desperate urgency. He nudged Eleanor's ankles, a familiar gesture of comfort now imbued with a terrifying directive. He was their guide, their primal compass in this chaotic storm. "He's heading towards the kitchen," Thomas grunted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He was wincing, his hand instinctively going to his side. The thought of navigating the length of the house, with the fire spreading with such terrifying speed, was a chilling one. But Jasper's insistence was undeniable. He was a creature of habit, and his deviation from their usual path was a clear signal that the familiar route was no longer an option. They pressed on, a clumsy and trembling trio, the air growing hotter, the smoke denser. Eleanor stumbled, her foot catching on something unseen in the gloom. Thomas's hand shot out, steadying her with a grip that belied his weakened state. "Easy, Elle," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep and fear. The kitchen was their goal, a distant promise of escape. Eleanor's mind raced, a well-oiled machine of logic and calm struggling against the rising tide of panic. Lily. Where was Lily? Her daughter. A wave of fresh terror washed over her, threatening to drown her with its intensity. "Lily!" she cried out, her voice a thin thread against the roar of the fire. "She's in her room, Eleanor. We have to get to her," Thomas said, his face etched with worry. He knew the layout of the house, the proximity of Lily's room to the fire's origin. It was a terrifying calculation. Jasper paused at the entrance to what Eleanor vaguely recognized as the dining room, his tail bushed out like a bottle brush, his body rigid. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that resonated deep within Eleanor, a primal alarm bell. "What is it, boy?" Thomas whispered, his eyes scanning the gloom. A faint, flickering glow emanated from the far end of the dining room, a weak, flickering light that seemed to mock their desperate flight. It's spreading faster than I thought. Eleanor breathed, a chill of dread seeping into her bones. The scent of burnt sugar, the initial harbinger of doom, was now overpowered by the acrid, biting stench of burning wood and plastic. The heat intensified, a palpable wall pushing against them. Jasper, with a sudden burst of speed, darted into the dining room, disappearing into the swirling haze. Eleanor and Thomas exchanged a frantic glance. "We can't lose him," Thomas said, his voice grim. They followed, their movements hampered by the thick smoke and the growing heat. The dining room, usually a space of quiet family meals, was now a terrifying tableau. Flames, like hungry tongues, were licking at the far end, creeping along the walls, devouring the familiar furniture. The crackling was deafening, the roar of the inferno a hungry beast devouring their home. Jasper reappeared, nudging at Lily's bedroom door, which was thankfully still closed. A small mercy in this unfolding disaster. Eleanor's heart leaped into her throat, a frantic bird trapped in her chest. "Lily!" she screamed, pounding on the door. "Mom? Dad?" Lily's voice, small and trembling, came from within. Relief, so potent it was almost painful, washed over Eleanor. "Lily, open the door, sweetie. It's Mom! Quickly!" Eleanor urged, her voice cracking with emotion. The lock clicked, and Lily, her eyes wide with terror, stood framed in the doorway. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair disheveled. She clutched a worn teddy bear, her small body trembling. The sight of her, so vulnerable and asleep just moments ago, sent a fresh wave of terror through Eleanor. "Mom, it's so smoky!" Lily cried, her voice choked with dust. "I know, honey. We have to go. Now," Thomas said, his voice strained. He put a protective arm around Lily, pulling her close. Jasper, sensing the reunion, rubbed against Lily's legs, a soft rumble of contentment in his throat, a stark contrast to the chaos around them. But his comfort was short-lived. The roar of the fire intensified, and a blast of hot, smoky air swept through the hallway, pushing them back. The flames, which had been licking at the far end of the dining room, were now making a terrifyingly swift advance. "The staircase is out. The hallway is blocked," Eleanor said, her mind racing. "The kitchen. We have to go through the kitchen. It's our only way out." Thomas nodded grimly, his eyes assessing the situation. The kitchen was at the opposite end of the house from the master bedroom, meaning they had to traverse the length of the burning structure. It was a long route, but potentially safer than attempting to brave the inferno that had consumed the main staircase. "Jasper, lead us to the kitchen," Eleanor commanded, her voice firm despite the fear that threatened to consume her. Jasper, as if understanding the gravity of the situation, let out a determined yowl and turned, heading towards the back of the house. They followed, a desperate, determined unit, Jasper's frantic, furry form a small beacon of hope in the terrifying scene. The house groaned around them, the sounds of splintering wood and collapsing structures echoing through the smoke-filled air. They moved through rooms that were rapidly transforming into infernos. The heat was unbearable now, a physical force pushing them onward. Eleanor could feel the sweat trickling down her back, her lungs burning with every breath. Lily whimpered, burying her face in Thomas's chest. Thomas, despite his injury, was a pillar of strength, his primal urge to protect his family overriding his pain. He guided them, his eyes scanning for any new dangers, any possible escape routes. But the fire was relentless, a raging inferno that seemed to be consuming everything in its path. They reached the kitchen, a space that, just hours before, had been filled with the comforting aroma of brewing coffee. Now it was filled with thick, acrid smoke. The flames were not yet fully inside, but they could see the terrifying glow through the doorway, hear the hungry roar just beyond. "The back door!" Thomas panted, pointing towards it. It was their last hope. Jasper, however, had stopped at the entrance to the kitchen, his attention fixed on the pantry door. He began to scratch at it, a frantic, repeated motion. "Jasper, what is it?" Eleanor asked, her voice strained. He let out a series of sharp, insistent meows, his gaze unwavering. Eleanor, trusting her cat's instincts, moved towards the pantry. She hesitated for a moment, her hand on the cool metal handle, then pulled it open. Inside, nestled amongst shelves of canned goods and bags of flour, was a small, almost imperceptible gap in the wall, leading to the exterior. It was a narrow opening, barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. But it was an opening nonetheless. It was an escape. "Oh, Jasper," Eleanor breathed, tears streaming down her face. "You found it." "Go, go," Thomas urged, pushing Lily towards the opening. "Eleanor, you first, then Lily." "I'll be right behind you." Eleanor squeezed through the narrow gap, the rough wood scraping against her skin. She tumbled out into the blessedly cool night air, gasping for breath. The familiar expanse of their backyard was bathed in the terrifying glow of the fire that was now consuming their home. Lily followed, her small body surprisingly agile. Then came Thomas, wincing as he moved, his strength visibly flagging. He collapsed onto the grass beside them, his chest heaving. Jasper, with a final, triumphant yowl, leaped through the opening and landed beside them, purring and rubbing against their legs, a small beacon of comfort in the face of utter devastation. They watched, huddled together, as their home, their sanctuary, was reduced to a raging inferno. The flames roared, a terrifying symphony of destruction, licking at the sky. The heat, even from this distance, was intense. But they were alive. They were together. And it was all thanks to a small, furry creature with eyes like chips of sapphire and a heart full of unwavering devotion. Jasper, the cat who had woken them from their slumber, had saved them all. The acrid, biting stench of smoke clawed at Eleanor's throat, a stark contrast to the phantom sweetness that had first pricked her senses. It was a smell that spoke of ruin, of consumption, of something precious turning to ash. Her heart, a frantic bird trapped in her chest, beat a desperate rhythm against her ribs. Beside her, Jasper, normally a creature of fastidious routine and hushed purrs, was a rigid coil of frantic energy. His fur, usually a silken tapestry of cream and sable, bristled with an intensity she'd never witnessed. His sapphire eyes, wide and darting, reflected the encroaching darkness that was no longer just the absence of light, but a tangible, suffocating presence. "Jasper, what is it?" she whispered, her voice already hoarse with a rising fear. He responded not with a meow, but with a low, guttural cry, a sound that resonated deep within her, a primal alarm that bypassed conscious thought. He nudged her hand with his head, then darted towards the bedroom door, his tail bushed out like a bottle brush, a clear signal of extreme distress. Then she smelled it more strongly, the unmistakable, terrifying scent of burning wood. A thin, hazy tendril of gray smoke snaked its way from beneath the bedroom door, a spectral figure announcing the arrival of a hungry beast. Panic. A cold hand squeezed her lungs, making each breath a shallow, inadequate struggle. Thomas. Lily. They were still asleep, vulnerable and unaware of the unfolding disaster. She scrambled out of bed, her movements clumsy and trembling, the plush carpet feeling strangely alien beneath her bare feet. Jasper weaved frantically around her ankles, his insistent yowls a terrifying soundtrack to her dawning horror. She reached for the doorknob, her hand shaking, a wave of dread washing over her. What lay beyond? The faint, flickering glow she'd glimpsed earlier coalesced into a more definite image. The hallway, The staircase, the main artery of their home, was being consumed. "Thomas!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She yanked the door open, and a blast of hot, smoky air, thick and suffocating, slammed into her. The hallway was a swirling vortex of gray, the familiar expanse of muted colors now cloaked in an impenetrable haze. The crackling sound, a hungry beast devouring the house, filled her ears, punctuated by the sickening pop and hiss of something giving way. Flames, like hungry tongues, licked at the far end, near the staircase, casting a terrifying, flickering light that danced with the indistinct shadows. Jasper, despite the blinding smoke and the roar of the fire, didn't hesitate. He darted into the hallway, not towards the inferno, but away from it, towards the back of the house. Eleanor, her vision blurred by stinging eyes and the searing heat, followed, her mind a chaotic storm of terror and a desperate primal urge to protect. She heard Thomas's voice, rough with sleep and fear, from the direction of their bedroom. "Eleanor, what's going on?" He emerged from the room, his body protesting, a dull throb undoubtedly echoing from his recent surgery. He stumbled slightly, his eyes wide with dawning comprehension, his gaze fixed on the terrifying scene unfolding before him. Lily's room was further down the hall, closer to the fire. A chilling dread, cold and sharp, pierced through Eleanor. "Thomas! Lily!" she choked out, pointing a trembling finger. He didn't need further prompting. Despite the pain that was clearly compromising his usual strength, he moved with a surprising surge of adrenaline. "Get Lily! I'll go for the kitchen!" he yelled, his voice strained and choked by the smoke. He grabbed Eleanor's arm, his grip firm, a desperate reassurance in the unfolding disaster. "Jasper, stay with them." But Jasper, a small beacon of frantic energy amplified by the primal fear gripping the house, was already a blur of motion. He veered away from Thomas, darting towards Lily's room, his insistent yowls cutting through the roar of the flames. Eleanor, her lungs burning, her eyes streaming uncontrollably, followed Jasper, her heart aching with a terrifying gamble. The hallway was a terrifying inferno, the wooden banister already engulfed, the flames licking greedily at the ceiling. The heat was intense, a physical force pressing in on her, making the air feel impossibly thin. She reached Lily's door, fumbling with the handle, her fingers numb and clumsy. She threw it open, and the smoke, even thicker here, billowed out. Lily was sitting up in bed, her eyes wide with terror, a silent scream frozen on her face. "Mommy!" she wailed, her voice a thin thread against the cacophony of the fire. Jasper was already on the bed, nudging Lily's face with his head, his yowls now a series of sharp, urgent commands. Eleanor scooped Lily into her arms, Lily's small body trembling against her chest. "It's okay, baby, it's okay," Eleanor murmured, though her own voice quivered. "We're going to get out." The hallway was a wall of fire. The staircase, the usual route to the front door, was a raging inferno, a terrifying barrier of heat and smoke. They were trapped. Eleanor's mind raced, a jumble of fear and a desperate search for an alternative. Then she remembered Thomas's shout. The kitchen. The back of the house. It was a longer route, but potentially safer. "Jasper, come on!" she urged, her voice raw with fear. She turned, Lily clutched tightly, and began to move, not towards the inferno, but away from it, towards the back of the house. Jasper, a frantic, furry shadow, stayed close, weaving between her legs, his insistent meows a constant, unnerving guide. The air grew thicker, hotter, the crackling intensified, the roaring of the flames a constant, terrifying presence. She could feel the heat radiating through the walls, the floor, even through Lily's thin pajamas. She heard Thomas again, his voice closer now, a desperate soundtrack to their escape. "Eleanor, this way!" He was in the kitchen, his silhouette visible through the haze. He was holding the back door open, his face etched with worry, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He'd managed to get out, and he was waiting for them. Eleanor stumbled into the kitchen, Lily still in her arms. The heat here was still intense, but it was less direct, less all-consuming than in the hallway. The kitchen itself was relatively clear, though tendrils of smoke snaked in from the adjoining rooms. Thomas met them, his eyes scanning them both, his relief palpable, though quickly overshadowed by the urgency of their situation. "We have to go now," he urged, his voice strained. He gestured towards the open back door and the dark expanse of the backyard. Jasper, however, wasn't moving towards the door. He was at the pantry, his yowls now a frantic, repeated motion, scratching at the door, then looking back at Eleanor, then at the pantry again. It was a terrifying and a clear directive. "What is it, Jasper?" Eleanor whispered, her eyes darting between the cat and the pantry door. Thomas, his logic and calm kicking in despite the chaotic storm around them, followed Jasper's gaze. "The pantry," Thomas said, his voice a low growl. "There's a crawl space back there, for when we had that leak last spring. I boarded it up, but there's a small gap." Hope, a fragile flicker in the overwhelming darkness, ignited within Eleanor. A gap. An escape. Thomas kicked at the pantry door, splintering the wood. He ripped it open. The smell of stored goods, of dry goods and spices, mingled with the acrid stench of smoke. Jasper was already inside, his small body a furious blur of motion, nudging at a section of the back wall. Eleanor and Thomas followed, Lily still clutched tightly. There it was. A small gap, barely wide enough for Jasper, and perhaps for a child to squeeze through. It was dark, dusty, and uninviting, but it was an escape. "This is it," Thomas said, his voice grim. "It's a tight squeeze, but it's our only way." He looked at Eleanor, his eyes conveying 1,000 unspoken fears and a fierce determination. "You first with Lily. I'll be right behind you." Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding like a drum against her ribs. She knelt, placing Lily carefully on the floor. "Lily, baby, you have to be brave. We're going to crawl through this little hole. Mommy will be right behind you." Lily, her face streaked with tears and soot, nodded, her small hands reaching for Eleanor. Eleanor pushed Lily gently towards the gap. "Go, baby, go." Lily hesitated for a moment, then, with a surge of courage that belied her age, she wriggled into the opening. Eleanor watched her go, a wave of relief washing over her, quickly followed by a fresh wave of terror as she heard the roar of the fire intensify, closer now, more insistent. The walls of the pantry seemed to groan under the onslaught. "Go, Eleanor, go!" Thomas urged, his hand on her shoulder, a reassuring weight. Eleanor took a deep, shuddering breath, the smoky air burning her lungs. Then she followed her daughter, squeezing through the narrow gap, Jasper a warm, furry presence at her side, nudging her forward, his insistent purr a strange, comforting rumble against the terrifying soundtrack of their home's destruction. She could hear Thomas behind her, his grunts of exertion as he, hampered by his recent surgery, wriggled through the opening. The heat was palpable, even through the thin wall. She could hear the crackling of flames, the sickening groan of timbers giving way. Then, with a final push, Eleanor tumbled out onto the cool, dewy grass of the backyard. Lily was already there, sobbing quietly, wrapped in Thomas's arms. Thomas himself emerged moments later, wincing, his face smudged with soot, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Jasper, triumphant and surprisingly calm, trotted out behind him, shaking himself as if to shed the soot and the terror. They huddled together in the darkness of the backyard, watching in stunned silence as their home, their sanctuary, was consumed by a raging inferno. Flames, bright and terrifying, erupted from the windows, painting the night sky in shades of orange and red. The roof caved in with a deafening roar, sending a shower of sparks into the air. The house, the place where they had shared laughter and tears, where Lily had grown, where Thomas had recovered, was being devoured by a hungry beast. Eleanor, her arms around Lily, her gaze fixed on the unfolding disaster, felt a profound sense of loss, but also a fierce, overwhelming gratitude. Jasper, the small, unassuming creature of habit, had saved them. He had sensed the danger, alerted them, and guided them to safety. He was more than a pet. He was a member of their family, an unlikely hero with eyes like chips of sapphire and a heart as brave as any warrior. He nudged her hand, a soft, familiar gesture, and Eleanor, her voice hoarse with emotion, whispered, "Thank you, Jasper. Thank you." The silent, burning testament to their home's destruction was a devastating sight, but in the midst of the ashes, a new flame of resilience, fueled by love and the quiet strength of a cat, had been ignited. The acrid sting of smoke, no longer a phantom sweetness, clawed at Eleanor's throat. The night air, once cool and comforting, now felt thick and suffocating, a tangible blanket woven from the destruction of their sanctuary. Beside her, Lily coughed, a small, ragged sound that tore at Eleanor's heart. Jasper, a small beacon of frantic energy, weaved between their legs, his insistent yowls now a desperate soundtrack to their unfolding disaster. They stood in the backyard, a patch of dew-kissed grass that had, mere minutes before, been the backdrop to quiet summer evenings. Now, it was their escape. The familiar expanse of muted colors, the deep green of the lawn, the darker hues of the towering oaks, the pale silver of the moon, was being consumed by a swirling vortex of gray and orange. Flames, like hungry tongues, licked at the far end of the house, devouring the roof with a terrifying roar. Thomas, his face etched with worry and pain, leaned against the cool brick of the garage, his body protesting every movement. The dull throb of his recent surgery was a constant companion, amplified by the adrenaline coursing through him. He watched the inferno, his eyes watering uncontrollably, his breathing strained and choked. The main artery of their home, the central staircase, was a raging inferno, a fiery maw that had nearly swallowed them whole. "Jasper," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse, raw with fear. She knelt, scooping the trembling cat into her arms. His silky fur, usually so sleek and comforting, felt hot against her cheek. He purred, a rumbling vibration that resonated deep within her, a fragile lifeline in the chaos. "You saved us, boy. You saved us all." Lily, her small hands gripping Eleanor's pajama top, pointed a trembling finger. "Mommy, look!" The flames, a terrifying and undeniable reality, were climbing higher, consuming the second story with a terrifying speed. The crackling sound, a hungry beast devouring their lives, filled the air, drowning out the distant wail of sirens that had finally begun to pierce the quietude. A wave of dread washed over Eleanor, cold and sharp. Their home, their memories, their entire world was turning to ash before their eyes. Thomas pushed himself away from the garage, his movements clumsy and trembling. "We need to get further away," he rasped, his voice rough with smoke and fear. "We don't know how far this will spread." Eleanor nodded, her eyes never leaving the house. It was a familiar sight, rendered alien and terrifying by the encroaching darkness and the hungry flames. The house where they had celebrated birthdays, where Lily had learned to ride her bike, where they had built a life, was being systematically dismantled by a force beyond their control. "The pantry," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Jasper." He led us to the pantry. The memory of the cat's insistent nudges, his desperate meows that had propelled them through the smoke-filled hallway, replayed in her mind. It was a clear directive, a primal urge to protect that had transcended his usual feline aloofness. Thomas followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the burning structure. The pantry. Was that the back wall? Near the kitchen? Yes, Eleanor confirmed, her heart aching. There was that small gap. The one we always meant to fix. Jasper went right for it. They began to move, a small, ragged procession of survivors. Eleanor held Lily close, her arm a protective barrier. Thomas, his gait uneven, stayed close, his gaze sweeping their surroundings, assessing the immediate danger. Jasper, released from Eleanor's arms, darted ahead, his tail bushed out like a bottle brush, a tiny, furry shadow against the inferno. He paused at the edge of the lawn, looking back, a silent, insistent beckoning. As they drew closer to the back of the house, the heat intensified. The air shimmered, and the roar of the fire seemed to vibrate through the very ground. They could see the kitchen windows, dark and vacant, a stark contrast to the hellish glow emanating from the front of the house. The pantry, a small addition tucked onto the side, was still intact, though smoke was beginning to seep from its seams. Jasper led them directly to the pantry door. Eleanor's hand trembled as she reached for the knob. It was cool to the touch, a surprising anomaly in the rising tide of heat. She pulled it open, and a blast of hot, smoky air hit them, stinging their eyes. The small room was filled with a hazy tendril of smoke, but the inferno hadn't yet breached its walls. Jasper immediately made a beeline for the back wall, scratching insistently at a section of paneling. Eleanor remembered it now, a small, almost imperceptible gap, hidden behind shelves of canned goods and forgotten appliances. It was barely large enough for a person to squeeze through. "This is it," Thomas breathed, his voice strained. "This is how he got us out." He looked at Jasper, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and gratitude. The cat, usually so particular about his routines, had instinctively known the way to freedom, a narrow escape route he'd likely discovered during one of his nocturnal explorations. Eleanor pushed aside a stack of dusty jars. The gap was indeed small, a dark slit in the wood. "Lily, you first," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Lily, her face smudged with soot and tears, nodded bravely. Eleanor guided her towards the opening. "Crawl through, honey. Mommy's right behind you." Lily hesitated for a moment, glancing back at the burning house, her eyes wide with a child's terror. Then, with a surge of courage fueled by her mother's presence, she wriggled into the gap. Eleanor heard her muffled cry of relief from the other side. Next was Eleanor. She pushed Jasper towards the opening. "Go, Jasper, go!" The cat, with a surprising agility, slipped through the narrow space. Eleanor took a deep, shaky breath, the smoky air burning her lungs. She squeezed herself into the opening, scraping her shoulders and hips against the rough wood. It was a claustrophobic, terrifying struggle, but the thought of Thomas, still on the other side, spurred her on. She emerged into the cool night air, gasping for breath. Lily was already a few feet away, clinging to Thomas's hand. Jasper sat proudly at his daughter's feet, his sapphire eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fire. Thomas was next. He winced as he maneuvered his body through the tight space, his recent surgery clearly compromised by the awkward passage. Eleanor reached out, her hand finding his, her grip tightening with a fierce possessiveness. "Almost there," she encouraged, pulling him forward. Finally, with a grunt of effort, Thomas was through. He collapsed onto the grass, his chest heaving. They were all out. Safe. They huddled together, a small, defiant island of life against the backdrop of their home's fiery demise. The flames roared, a terrifying symphony of destruction. The roof caved in with a sickening groan, sending a shower of sparks into the night sky. The heat, even from this distance, was intense. Eleanor looked at Thomas, his face grimy and streaked with sweat, his body racked with pain, but his eyes held hers with a fierce, unwavering love. She looked at Lily, her small hand still clutching Eleanor's shirt, her face a mixture of shock and dawning relief. And she looked at Jasper, the unlikely hero, who sat serenely amidst the chaos, his tail giving a gentle swish. The phantom sweetness of burnt sugar was gone, replaced by the acrid, biting stench of their burning home. But in its place, something else had taken root. A profound sense of gratitude. They had lost everything, their possessions, their memories etched into the very walls of that house. But they had each other, and they had Jasper. He nudged Eleanor's hand with his head, a soft, insistent gesture. She buried her face in his fur, tears of relief and sorrow mingling. "Thank you, Jasper," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for waking us. Thank you for saving us." The cat purred, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to echo the quiet strength of their survival. He had been a creature of habit, a connoisseur of comfort, and in the face of unimaginable danger, he had become something more. A guardian, a protector, a furry, four-legged angel who had nudged them from the brink of disaster and into the safe, if uncertain, embrace of the night. The origin of the fire, the phantom scent, the how and why, it all faded into insignificance against the sheer, undeniable fact of their survival. They were alive, and that, in the face of such devastation, was everything. The acrid bite of smoke still clung to their throats, a phantom scent mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Eleanor, shivering despite the late summer air, clutched Lily to her side, her daughter's small body trembling against her own. The scene before them was a terrifying tableau. Their home, once a sanctuary of muted colors and quiet routines, was now a roaring inferno, a hungry beast devouring everything familiar. Flames, like greedy tongues, licked at the roofline, painting the night sky in lurid shades of orange and crimson. The crackling symphony of destruction was a guttural roar that vibrated deep in Eleanor's bones. Jasper, a sleek, dark shadow against the chaos, sat a few feet away, his sapphire eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the unfolding disaster. His tail, usually a graceful plume, was held rigidly, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed energy of the fire. He hadn't made a sound since they'd emerged from the cramped crawl space into the blessed, albeit smoky, air of the backyard. His silence was, in its own way, as unnerving as his earlier frantic yowls had been. Thomas, his face etched with a pain that went beyond the dull throb of his recent surgery, stood a little apart, his gaze sweeping over the inferno. He held a hand to his side, where the bandages were likely already stained, but his focus was entirely outward. His quiet strength, so often a comforting anchor, now seemed amplified by the sheer terror of the moment. He was assessing, calculating, even as his body protested. "Are you all right, Tom?" Eleanor's voice was a hoarse whisper, rough with smoke and fear. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in their depths. Relief. Profound and overwhelming, mixed with a helplessness that made her heart ache. "We're out. That's all that matters." He coughed, a deep rattling sound that seemed to tear at his healing stitches. "Lily." Lily, her face buried in Eleanor's shoulder, managed a small, choked sob. Eleanor stroked her hair, murmuring reassurances she barely felt herself. "We're safe, sweetie. We're all safe." The wail of approaching sirens sliced through the night, a welcome sound, a promise of help. Soon the quiet suburban street was a hive of activity. Flashing red and blue lights painted the smoke-filled air, illuminating the frantic dance of firefighters as they battled the raging inferno. Neighbors, roused by the commotion, clustered on lawns, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. A paramedic, his face grim and streaked with soot, approached them. "Are you all accounted for? Anyone hurt?" Thomas, wincing as he gestured to his side, said, "Just me. Recent surgery. Nothing the fire aggravated, thankfully. We're all out." The paramedic nodded, his eyes lingering on Thomas's bandaged side. "We'll get you checked out, sir. And you, ma'am, and the young lady. We need to make sure you haven't inhaled too much smoke." As they were led to an ambulance, Eleanor's gaze kept returning to Jasper. He remained where they had left him, a statue of feline composure amidst the unfolding chaos. He watched the firefighters, his head tilting as if in silent observation. It was then, as the flashing lights illuminated his sleek fur, that Eleanor noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge of soot on his pristine white chest. "Jasper," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. She nudged Lily gently. "Look." Lily, her eyes still puffy and red, peered at the cat. A small, tremulous smile touched her lips. "Jasper's dirty." Eleanor knelt, ignoring the dampness of the grass, and reached for him. Jasper, with a surprising lack of his usual aloofness, leaned into her touch. She gently stroked his head, her fingers finding the faint smudge. It was there, a tiny testament to his bravery. He had been the first to sense the danger, the one who had pushed through the choking smoke, the one who had guided them. As the paramedics checked them over, the initial shock began to recede, replaced by a dawning realization of what they had lost. The familiar expanse of muted colors, the worn armchair where Thomas read his books, Lily's meticulously organized shelves, the scent of Eleanor's favorite lavender candles, all gone, reduced to ash and smoke. The phantom sweetness she had smelled earlier, the one that had seemed so out of place, now felt like a cruel premonition, a whisper of the destruction to come. How did it start?" Lily asked, her voice small and reedy. Thomas shook his head, his gaze still fixed on the skeletal remains of their home. "They'll investigate. We don't know yet." Eleanor's mind replayed the sequence of events. Jasper's insistent nudges, the guttural cry, the prickle of unease that had sharpened into chilling dread. She remembered the faint scent, almost like burnt sugar, that had first roused her. Had it been a warning? A sign of something amiss even before the visible smoke? "He woke me," Eleanor said, her voice gaining a little strength. Jasper. He wouldn't stop. "He just kept meowing, and then he pushed at my door." She looked at Jasper, who had now settled beside her, his usual dignified posture a stark contrast to the surrounding devastation. "He saved us." The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken gratitude. The firefighters were beginning to gain control, the roar of the flames subsiding into a furious hiss. The acrid stench of burnt wood and plastic filled the air, a suffocating blanket. "He's a hero," Thomas said, his voice rough, reaching out to rest a hand on Jasper's head. The cat, for the first time that night, let out a soft, rumbling purr, a sound of comfort in the midst of despair. The next few hours were a blur of official questions, sympathetic neighbors offering blankets and cups of tea, and the overwhelming, surreal experience of being homeless. They were taken to a temporary shelter, a sterile, echoing space that felt 1,000,000 miles away from the warmth and comfort of their lost home. Lily, exhausted and traumatized, finally drifted off to sleep in Eleanor's arms, still clutching a tattered teddy bear. Thomas, despite his pain, stayed awake, his arm around Eleanor. "We'll rebuild," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "We'll figure it out." Eleanor nodded, her eyes closed, trying to block out the image of the flames, but she couldn't. The image of her home, consumed by fire, was seared into her mind. And then she thought of Jasper. The phantom sweetness, the unusual distress. Had it been a warning from him? A scent only he could detect, a premonition of the disaster? She opened her eyes and looked at Jasper, who was curled on a borrowed blanket, his breathing deep and even. He seemed strangely serene, as if he had merely completed a difficult task. Eleanor's gaze drifted back to the smudge of soot on his chest, a tiny dark mark against his pristine fur. She reached out and gently touched it. It was real. A tangible reminder that this extraordinary creature, her Jasper, had not just been a pet, but a guardian. The mystery of the burnt sugar scent lingered. Had it been a precursor to the fire? A subtle warning that only Jasper, with his heightened senses, had truly registered? Or had it been something else entirely? A strange anomaly in the unfolding tragedy. Eleanor knew, with a certainty that settled deep within her, that Jasper's actions had been more than just instinct. There had been a directive in his cries, a clear purpose in his frantic nudges. He had understood. He had known. As the first pale light of dawn began to creep into the sky, casting long gray shadows across the unfamiliar room, Eleanor held Jasper a little closer. He was more than just a cat. He was family. And tonight, he had been their savior, a small, furry beacon of frantic energy in the face of overwhelming darkness. The loss of their home was a gaping wound, but they were alive, and for that, they owed everything to the cat who had woken them, and in doing so, had saved them all. The phantom sweetness, once a source of confusion, now felt like a whisper of providence, a hint that even in the face of unimaginable destruction, there could be a guiding force, a silent protector watching over them. The investigation into the fire's origin would begin, but for Eleanor, the true story had already been written, etched in the soot on Jasper's chest and the grateful thumping of her own heart. The cool night air, a stark contrast to the inferno they'd just escaped, did little to soothe the frantic bird trapped in Eleanor's chest. She coughed, a ragged sound that tore at her throat, the acrid sting of smoke still clinging to her lungs. Beside her, Thomas's breathing was shallow, punctuated by the dull throb of his recent surgery, his body protesting the brutal exertion. Lily, a small, trembling heap of a girl, clung to Eleanor's side, her face streaked with soot and tears. And then there was Jasper. He sat a few feet away, a small, dark silhouette against the flickering orange glow that was rapidly consuming their once familiar home. His tail, usually a sleek, elegant curve, was still slightly bushed, a residual sign of the primal terror that had driven him. He wasn't purring, not yet, but his sapphire eyes, luminous in the dim light, were fixed on them, a silent sentinel. He'd done it. The creature of refined habits, of sunbeams and precisely timed meals, had become their wild, furry savior. The roar of the fire was a terrifying soundtrack to their survival. It was a hungry beast, devouring the house with insatiable ferocity. Flames, like greedy tongues, licked at the wooden banister, climbed the walls, and spewed from the shattered windows. The heat, even from this distance, was a tangible presence, a wave of oppressive warmth that pressed against their skin. Eleanor watched, numb, as the roof began to buckle, a groan of tortured wood echoing through the night. Their sanctuary, their haven, was being reduced to embers. We need to call someone," Thomas rasped, his voice rough with smoke and exhaustion. He fumbled for his phone, his movements clumsy and trembling. Eleanor's own phone was likely a melted mess inside the house. Lily whimpered, burying her face in Eleanor's side. "Mommy, where will we go?" Eleanor wrapped an arm around her daughter, her own heart aching with the immensity of their loss. The scent of burnt sugar, that phantom sweetness that had first alerted her, was now a cruel mockery, a harbinger of this devastating destruction. How had it started? A faulty wire? An accident? The question swirled in the hazy tendrils of smoke that still drifted through the air. But they were secondary to the immediate reality of their survival. Neighbors, alerted by the growing inferno and the wail of distant sirens, began to emerge from their homes, their faces etched with a mixture of shock and concern. A woman from 2 doors down, Mrs. Henderson, rushed over, her eyes wide. "Oh, my word! Eleanor! Thomas!" "Are you all right?" Eleanor managed a shaky nod, her voice a hoarse whisper. We're out, thanks to Jasper." She gestured weakly towards the cat, who now seemed to be meticulously grooming a paw, as if the night's events were a minor inconvenience. Thomas, his face pale and drawn, was already talking to a neighbor who had a working phone. The urgency in his voice was a low hum beneath the crackling symphony of destruction. He was already calculating, planning. His mind, despite the pain and the shock, working with a familiar, well-oiled logic. The fire department arrived in a flurry of flashing lights and wailing sirens. The once familiar expanse of their backyard, now a chaotic storm of flashing red and blue, was suddenly alive with activity. Firefighters, clad in their protective gear, moved with a grim efficiency, their hoses spewing torrents of water onto the raging inferno. The air filled with the hiss and steam of water meeting fire, a desperate attempt to tame the beast. Eleanor watched them, a detached observer of her own tragedy. The smell of smoke was overpowering now, a thick, suffocating blanket that stung her eyes and seared her nostrils. She felt a profound sense of disorientation. Their lives, so meticulously ordered, so comfortably familiar, had been ripped apart in a matter of minutes. The small pantry gap, Jasper's insistent nudges, the terrifying dash through the smoke. It all felt like a dream, a fevered nightmare. Lily, her initial shock giving way to a raw, primal fear, began to cry again. "My teddy bear, my books, they're all gone." Eleanor pulled her daughter closer. "I know, sweetie. It's okay. We'll get new ones. We're together. That's what matters." The words felt hollow, inadequate against the backdrop of such profound loss, but she clung to them, to the truth they held. Thomas returned, his hand resting on Lily's back. "They're doing everything they can, but it's bad, El. Really bad." He met Eleanor's gaze, and in his eyes, she saw a reflection of her own despair, but also a flicker of resilience. "We lost the house, but we didn't lose each other. That's something." Jasper, as if sensing the shift in the immediate danger, trotted over and rubbed against Thomas's leg, a low, rumbling purr finally vibrating through his small body. It was a sound of comfort, of reassurance, a tiny beacon of normalcy in the unfolding disaster. Thomas reached down and scratched Jasper behind the ears, his touch gentle. "And we didn't lose our little hero, did we?" The next few hours were a blur of hushed conversations with the fire chief, statements to the police, and the overwhelming realization that they had nothing but the clothes on their backs and the family they had managed to rescue. Neighbors offered blankets, water, and a temporary refuge. The insurance adjusters would come, the paperwork would pile up, but for now, they were simply survivors, huddled together on the cold, damp grass of their neighbor's lawn, watching the skeletal remains of their home smolder. Eleanor kept stealing glances at Jasper. He was curled up on Thomas's lap, his purr a steady, comforting rhythm. He had been so out of character, so insistent. That phantom scent of burnt sugar. She replayed the sequence of events in her mind, trying to pinpoint the exact moment Jasper's unusual behavior became a clear directive. It wasn't just curiosity or a shared reaction to the smoke. It was a primal urge, an instinct that had overridden his creature comforts, his carefully curated life. He had sensed the danger, not just the smoke, but the insidious, encroaching threat, and he had acted. She remembered the way his fur had bristled, the low growl that had rumbled in his chest before he'd even vocalized his alarm. It was as if he'd been wrestling with his own fear, his own instinct to hide, but the need to protect had won. He had deliberately, intentionally woken her, then guided them through the chaos. He hadn't just woken her, he had saved them. The thought of the pantry, of that tiny hidden gap, still sent a shiver down her spine. It was such a small thing, such an unlikely escape route. How had Jasper known? Had he played there as a kitten, exploring every nook and cranny of their home? Or had some deeper, more ancient instinct guided him? Thomas, sensing her unease, squeezed her hand. "Hey, we're okay. That's what matters." Eleanor leaned her head on his shoulder, the rough fabric of his borrowed t-shirt a familiar comfort. "I know. It's just a lot." She looked at Jasper, his eyes now closed, his purr a soft murmur. "He's our miracle, isn't he?" Thomas nodded, his gaze fixed on the cat. "He really is." He paused, then added softly, "You know, I was thinking about that burnt sugar smell. I've never smelled that before. Not in this house. And it was so faint at first." "Me neither," Eleanor whispered. "It was so strange. Like a ghost of something sweet, before the smoke even hit." The mystery of the fire's origin was a nagging question, a loose end in the tapestry of their survival. But as the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky in muted shades of gray and pink, casting long spectral shadows over the devastation, Eleanor knew that some mysteries were secondary. The primary truth was that they were alive. They had lost their home, their possessions, their sense of security, but they had each other. And they had Jasper, the small furry guardian who had defied his own nature to become their unlikely hero. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the full extent of the damage, a peculiar calm settled over Eleanor. It wasn't acceptance, not yet. It was more like a quiet strength, a deep well of resilience that had been forged in the crucible of fire. They would rebuild. They would find a new home. And they would never forget the night their ordinary cat became an extraordinary savior. Jasper, the Siamese who loved routine, had taught them the most important lesson of all: that love, loyalty, and instinct could conquer even the most terrifying inferno. He had woken them, not just from sleep, but from complacency, and in doing so, had given them a future. The acrid bite of smoke still clung to their throats, a phantom scent mingling with the metallic tang of fear. Eleanor, shivering despite the late summer air, clutched Lily to her side, her daughter's small body trembling against her own. The scene before them was a terrifying tableau. Their home, once a sanctuary of muted colors and quiet routines, was now a roaring inferno, a hungry beast devouring everything familiar. Flames, like greedy tongues, licked at the roofline, painting the night sky in lurid shades of orange and crimson. The crackling symphony of destruction was a guttural roar that vibrated deep in Eleanor's bones. Jasper, a small, dark silhouette against the chaos, sat a few feet away, his sapphire eyes wide and unblinking, fixed on the unfolding disaster. His tail, usually a sleek, elegant curve, was held rigidly, a stark contrast to the wild, untamed energy of the fire. He hadn't made a sound since they'd emerged from the cramped crawl space into the blessed, albeit smoky, air of the backyard. His silence was in its own way as unnerving as his earlier frantic yowls had been. "Thomas, His face etched with a pain that went beyond the dull throb of his recent surgery, stood a little apart, his gaze sweeping over the inferno. He held a hand to his side, where the bandages were likely already stained, but his focus was entirely outward. His quiet strength, so often a comforting anchor, now seemed amplified by the sheer terror of the moment. He was assessing, calculating, even as his body protested. "Are you all right, Tom?" Eleanor's voice was a hoarse whisper, rough with smoke and fear. He turned, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in their depths, relief, profound and overwhelming, mixed with a helplessness that made her heart ache. "We're out. That's all that matters." He coughed, a deep rattling sound that seemed to tear at his healing stitches. "Lily?" Lily, her face buried in Eleanor's shoulder, managed a small, choked sob. Eleanor stroked her hair, murmuring reassurances she barely felt herself. "We're safe, sweetie. We're all safe." The wail of approaching sirens sliced through the night, a welcome sound, a promise of help. Soon the quiet suburban street was a hive of activity. Flashing red and blue lights painted the smoke-filled air, illuminating the frantic dance of firefighters as they battled the raging inferno. Neighbors, roused by the commotion, clustered on lawns, their faces a mixture of shock and concern. A paramedic, his face grim and streaked with soot, approached them. "Are you all accounted for?" "Anyone hurt?" Thomas, wincing as he gestured to his side, said, "Just me. Recent surgery. Nothing the fire aggravated, thankfully." "We're all out." The paramedic nodded, his eyes lingering on Thomas's bandaged side. "We'll get you checked out, sir. And you, ma'am? And the young lady? We need to make sure you haven't inhaled too much smoke." As they were led to an ambulance, Eleanor's gaze kept returning to Jasper. He remained where they had left him, a statue of feline composure amidst the unfolding chaos. He watched the firefighters, his head tilting as if in silent observation. It was then, as the flashing lights illuminated his sleek fur, that Eleanor noticed it. A faint, almost imperceptible smudge of soot on his pristine white chest. "Jasper,"